It's the week ending Saturday the 17th of June, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen a fire destroy a tower block in West London, killing at least 17 people. Theresa May announced a Conservative government supported by the DUP, and Lord Buckethead appearing on US television offering to lead the Brexit negotiations. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team are Ashley Wassall, Cameron Tait, and making her Week Unwrapped debut, and therefore I imagine career peak, it's the Week Junior's Felicity Capon. Hello.
Hello.
Is it Capon or Capon?
It's Capon.
Let's call the whole thing off. Capon. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
The Week Junior is one of those things that, well, basically every intelligent 8-year-old that I know reads it. I mean, genuinely. It's an incredible publication, but for those who are perhaps not aware of what it is you do, sort of explaining the news to young people, isn't it?
It's pretty much, yes. It's making sense of the world around us. We look at the week's news, its current events, science stories, try and break it down and repackage it in a way that children will be able to understand and acknowledge what's going on in the world around them.
Okay, so obviously great publication when someone discovers a new moon on Jupiter. Difficult, isn't it, in a week like this? Lots of horrific news. How do you explain difficult news like the fire at Grenfell Tower? How do you explain difficult news like that to children?
I think the way we do that is we're not here to shelter children or to say that the world is this wonderful, magical place. I think we take these stories and these issues head on, but we're very keen to avoid sensationalism, speculation, bias, and to present the news calmly, and that's how we do it. Something
that the rest of us in the mainstream media could probably learn from. Well, as ever, let's move away from those big headlines to the stories you may have missed. Felicity, what have you brought with you?
Has a line been crossed for corporate America?
There was mixed reaction about this new twist.
I didn't like that they made this person who looks like Trump get assassinated. It's not a good message.
I don't think it's disrespectful for the president to be murdered on stage. It's not really the president's theater. Everybody knows it's theater.
That was an Inside Edition report into a staging of Shakespeare's Julius Caesar in New York, which opened this week. Felicity, everyone knows it's theatre, we heard one audience member say. Is that right?
You would think so, but actually the reaction suggests otherwise. The reaction's been quite staggering, really. Of course, anyone who's been following this story knows that the 400-year-old Shakespeare's play has been given a brand new lease of life. This is Caesar portrayed as a Trumpian figure with blonde hair, a blue suit, familiar hand gestures, a susceptibility to flattery, and his wife has an Eastern European accent. It is Trump, in short. So there's no getting away from that.
But it is also arguably satire, isn't it? Until, unfortunately, because this is Julius Caesar, there is a moment where he has to be killed on stage. I mean, I wonder if this was another Shakespeare play which didn't end like that, whether it would be applauded for, taking the bull by the horns.
Quite possibly. It's definitely the brutal and lengthy stabbing scene where Caesar succumbs to his wounds that has, seemingly shocked audience across America. News outlets such as Fox News and Breitbart are outraged by a depiction appearing to show the president assassinated under the American flag.
And what about you? Are you outraged?
I'm outraged by the outrage, I think. It is really quite remarkable. I'm not sure whether the same would happen in this country, and I wonder whether it's to do, whatever you may think of Trump, it is the commander-in-chief, the leader of America, seeing him being brutally murdered. That has obviously struck a chord. Are there echoes with the assassination of Kennedy? Is it something that is very close to American hearts? I don't know.
Well, that's it, isn't it? I mean, it is a different country to Britain. It has been a long time since we've seen one of our leaders murdered, but that does happen quite frequently in America. Ashley, do you think this was a mistake?
I'm kind of with the outrage about the outrage point, but it's not just that the outrage is perhaps misplaced. It's that the outrage is misunderstood the play, because Julius Caesar was not advocating for assassination. It doesn't end well for the conspirators, nor does it end well for what they wanted to achieve for Rome. Actually, the common interpretation, or one of the common interpretations of the play, is that by trying to get rid of a tyrant, they actually enforce the tyranny of the rule of Rome, and actually they contribute to the deterioration of its democracy. So I'm not 100% certain, actually, that they've really understood what they're complaining about. Because if anything, this kind of promotes don't kill Trump, rather than, it would be a good idea to do that.
And Cameron, the fact that you can argue whether it does or doesn't promote the killing of the president, is that just in itself distasteful?
I would say it's not distasteful. At the end of the day, it's freedom of speech and it's human expression to show this. Yes, they're showing Trump in this light that he is often reflected in as being a bit of a tyrant. But again, this is just human expression. It's challenging the government. But I do think if you take something like Kathy Griffin's, where she was holding the decapitated head of Donald Trump, that for me is crossing the line.
And what was that reference you're making to people who missed it? Kathy Griffin?
Kathy Griffin. She's an American comedian who was publicly shamed for holding what appeared to be the decapitated head of Donald Trump, and it had blood all over it. It was pretty horrific.
CNN actually cut their links with her slightly, and she was told she would no longer be part of New Year's Eve broadcast. So actually, it suggests that criticising Trump can, lead to you losing your job in some instances, and that maybe explains to some extent the fear of these two huge corporate sponsors pulling out.
So let's talk about that. So this is Bank of America and Delta Airlines.
That's correct.
They support this theatrical production in New York, and now they pulled out.
Yes, but only this play has been running since the end of May, so it wasn't from the get-go. It has taken a while for this huge outrage to blow up. Delta said it had crossed the lines on the standards of good taste, but it also seems that they have bowed to pressure from a lot of people on Twitter. There's been tweets saying, if something now happens to Trump, if someone does make an attempt on Trump's life, your companies will have blood on their hands. And it seems they have just been absolutely terrified by this and decided to drop out.
Doesn't it also show how shallow the criticism was, though? Because the production was there, they had sponsored it, presumably they had seen it or were aware of what was in it, and yet suddenly it's crossed the line. They're saying the content crossed the line when the outrage came. Before the outrage, they were perfectly happy with Trump to be assassinated, as long as people didn't complain about it.
But that's not how corporate sponsorship works, is it? They will have had a budget, they will have agreed it years ago, this is going to go to a theatre in New York, and then, probably they thought, this is a funny idea, Trump as Julius Caesar. It's fair enough that it's not until you see the moment where he is assassinated on stage that you do think, that's gone a little bit far.
But in which case, why does it matter whether they pull out or not? I mean, this is a piece of art. Some people like it, some people won't, and there'll be, there's intense criticism of it, whatever. This won't be the first piece of art that's ever been criticised. In this country, we've had all sorts of controversies. We may not have our leaders assassinated on the theatre stage every week down in the West End, but we have had, for example, Myra Hindley portrayed with children's hands in galleries that are sponsored by big corporations, and they didn't feel the need to pull out because everyone's aware that the corporate sponsorship isn't advocation for or isn't support for any particular piece of content. So I'm not really sure why anyone feels that them pulling out is an especially important milestone in all this.
That's a really interesting comparison because Sensation, the Saatchi exhibition that you're referring to, was it 1997, something like that? 20 years ago, there was no social media. So now, if you're running the Delta Airlines social media account and someone is constantly haranguing you, telling you, this is disgusting, you need to pull your name away from it, maybe they would pull out of a thing like Sensation now, and the world's just changed.
And what implication does that have for art then? So now the rule of the mob dictates what can go into an art exhibition. If someone wants to do a play that is controversial, and the Twitterati, I don't know, whatever the collective noun is for these people now, go mad about it, and the corporation is therefore forced to pull out, then there's no funding for those kind of things. That's going to make these organisations start to do tamer pieces of work or certainly less controversial pieces of work.
Well, I don't know. I think on the one hand, I imagine this play's popularity is going to soar based on all this outrage. I reckon that more people than ever will want to go and see it, which can only be a good thing on some level. But I think on the other hand, the point about these plays is that they are free and that they generate huge, and it's because of the corporate sponsors that you can go and see these plays for free. And I think that's quite chilling if it's suddenly a question of people won't be able to go for free because actually it was the corporate sponsors that were allowing that in the first place.
The reality is that theatres all over the world, and the West End is no different, don't make money from theatre tickets alone. They make money because they're sponsored and they're advertised. Or they're advertising sponsored. That's the only way they make a profit. So it's pretty critical if sponsors suddenly become, responsive to the content. The whole idea was they were sponsoring the endeavour of the art, and that's what they wanted to be associated with, the freedom of thought thing.
Surely they've got to accept that if they do sponsor something like art is meant to divide opinion, it's meant to raise questions. Surely they've got to be prepared for something like this, no?
But we have seen examples in this country, actually. You were saying this wouldn't happen here. Hilary Mantel did write about the assassination of Margaret Thatcher, didn't she? And that was pulled by the Telegraph.
Yeah, the Telegraph wouldn't publish that, and she had to defend that quite heavily, and that touched a huge note with people, saying especially it seemed to be supporting the IRA, and people were really unhappy about that. But yeah, and also she's been in trouble for criticising the Duchess of Cambridge Cambridge, and I think when we see people, our leaders or the royal family, I think people in this country, it does hit a note, definitely.
That's a difference in forum, though, isn't it? I mean, the Tory graph, as it is commonly known, not running a piece about Margaret Thatcher at a time of when she was, such in the forefront of people's minds, is very different from a public stage that doesn't have a political allegiance. I guess what I'm saying is sort of apples and pears. It's not quite an analogous example.
But where do you draw the line, though, in terms of, Donald Trump, despite the fact that, he's not someone that I would ever want to in any way suggest has any authority as the President of America, nonetheless is a real person, he's a human being, and you're depicting his death, and people are enjoying that and spending lots of money to go and see it. And you're saying it's fine to depict that, basically, because he's the President, his political statement is art. What about if they decided to depict the murder of his children as well? What if Baron Trump was represented on stage as a 12-year-old boy and he was assassinated and his head was decapitated as well? Would that be okay because it's art?
As a liberal, if I find something distasteful, that's not a reason to ban it. So the point at which you ban something is the point at which it incites actual violence. I don't think a depiction of someone dying in what is actually a reworking of a classic 400-year-old play could ever be determined to have incited a specific act, particularly not when it has such a nuanced interpretation. If someone went on stage and said, please go out now and kill Baron Trump, that's a different thing. That suddenly crosses the line. That's where we draw free speech, and I think free speech has to entail accepting things that you find utterly distasteful.
How would you consider the decapitated head from Kathy Griffin then? Because it's not inviting violence, but it's a violent image.
It was depicted as a perhaps misjudged, but it was depicted in the attempt to show some sort of within some sort of comedy routine. So I guess I'm forced to defend it. I don't actually find that a particularly funny thing. I think it is pretty distasteful. And if a particular programme doesn't want to run her anymore, that's their decision. But I don't think we should be saying that she shouldn't be able to do that.
Okay, Cameron, your turn. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Well, get your foil hats ready because the government really wants to watch you.
We cannot allow this ideology the safe space it needs to breed. Yet that is precisely what the internet and the big companies that provide internet-based services provide. We need to work with allied democratic governments to reach international agreements that regulate cyberspace to prevent the spread of extremist and terrorism planning. And we need to do everything we can at home to reduce the risks of extremism online.
The Prime Minister speaking outside Downing Street after the London Bridge terror attack at the start of the month. Now, Cameron, true to her word, Theresa May, the woman we are still calling the Prime Minister, even though George Osborne says she's a dead woman walking, she joined Emmanuel Macron this week and she did discuss this regulation of tech companies. What came out of that?
She did. So she met with Emmanuel Macron in France to discuss regulating content, extremist content on social media platforms and just online in general. And the outcome of that was they wanted to go in to say, let's do something about it. And they agreed that they want to do something about it. You're not going to see any real differences yet until they communicate with those tech companies such as Facebook or Google.
I mean, you cover tech for the week.
I do.
How likely is it that these American companies can be corralled by even Britain and France working together? I mean, for a start, they're not the USA, and secondly, they're global companies.
It's incredible. It's such an incredibly interesting topic because you've got a power struggle between the government and giant tech companies. So yes, while a lot of them are US based, essentially it's the government is telling them how to run their services, and I cannot see the government actually making any inroads onto it, and I think a lot of experts agree with me on that.
But the government is actually just trying, aren't they, to enforce the law, which is you can't tell people to blow themselves up and kill people, just like we were saying you can't tell people to go and murder Donald Trump.
Well, and also I challenge the idea that the government can't make these companies do something, because we have already had laws against Google for its search results. We already have at European...
What are those? What do we have?
So the European Union introduced laws that said that it's the right to be forgotten. So they have to, in Europe, remove from search results as a result of a complaint by somebody who, for example, may have had a prosecution which has since been spent, and who would argue that their reputation has now been unfairly tainted by that old news related to that still coming up in search results. They legislated to say that if that complaint was upheld, and all these companies have to have an internal complaints procedure now, Google, etc., they have to remove those items from their search results in Europe. And that's a law that passed. It's happened. It's in operation. I've worked on stories where actually we've tried to research something and it's disappeared from the internet. in Europe. Obviously, if you went to America, you'd still be able to find it.
Yeah. That's the Max Mosley example, isn't it?
Yeah. The argument that you can't actually make these companies do something. I mean, when they say, for example, Donald Trump talks about turning off the internet, those kind of nuclear button options are pretty unthinkable, or certainly how they would work is difficult to imagine. But the idea that the government doesn't have the power to force Google to do something is demonstrably incorrect.
Felicity, I mean, when it comes to young people, your readership, I mean, this is a particularly worrying area, isn't it? Because as much as sort of grown-ups will sit and say, oh, well, it's freedom of speech to be able to see this stuff. If you don't want to look at it, don't. It's difficult, isn't it, when a 12-year-old on their smartphone is able to access incitement to extremism?
Yes, hugely. I think that's, the internet is both a brilliant thing for young, inquisitive minds, but also it has its dangers too. And I think the idea that they're obviously far more impressionable and at an age where they're forming their thoughts and opinions. If they were to see something and to not really understand what it was saying or something like that, I think with sort of the idea that propaganda could have such a powerful influence on them can't be underestimated, and I think it is troubling.
And do you think actually companies, I mean, we always say companies like Google, but let's be honest, we're talking about Google, right? No one uses Bing, really. Do you think that Google have done enough by saying, right, well, we've got safe search? I mean, to take a pornographic example, the thing that people often say about kids is they'll type in the word beaver perfectly innocently, and you can imagine what they get as a result. Is it enough for adults just to laugh and say, oh, well, that's one way of learning? I mean, it's outrageous, isn't it, that these companies are selling their phones to children and children are able to access that stuff?
Yes, well, a lot of these phones that you can access the content on are, A, pretty damn expensive, and B, there are some parental locks that you can have on it. Parents can actually block access to the internet full stop on these devices, so kids can just play games or take pictures. But I would argue that the parents have got to look over the device if the child is going on the internet, especially if they're quite young, just to make sure that the content they're looking at is okay.
We're not talking about 3 and 4 year olds, which I think is what a lot of these controls are about. It's to stop people going in the App Store or children going in the App Store and spending hundreds of pounds in Candy Crush Saga or whatever.
But it's the 14-year-olds you want to stop
exactly.
the future having material.
But those 14-year-olds can probably go and unlock the whatever parental control has been put on at the level of the phone. Unless you've got something that the control is set outside of the device itself, a 14-year-old will find their way around that. I can kind of see the imperative, is what I'm saying, from the government's point of view of coming back to the earlier point about what freedom of speech is, which Olly was talking about. The idea is that you cannot say anything or promote anything that actually incites violence. And the content they're talking about is content that actively incites violence, tells you how to build a bomb, all things like that is what we're actually talking about here. And in any other, line of publishing, in any other world where things are published, that would be stopped. That would not be able to be published in a book, and yet on the internet we defend it as freedom of speech.
But are we not in danger of making social networks the content police, and it's suddenly down to Facebook or whoever to decide what is criminal content and what isn't? And actually, shouldn't that be the courts who are deciding that?
That's essentially what tech companies have actually come out and said. They've said, look, the government's telling us that we have to regulate this, so we have to be a technology company and the police at the same time.
They're monetizing it in real time, aren't they? If I start a Facebook video now called How to Build a Bomb, you'd have to be a genius to see that that's probably something that's ethically questionable and that they're monetizing it. So why shouldn't they say, no, we're not going to do that?
It's also not unheard of. In financial services, companies are legislated to be the first line of defence against, for example, money laundering. There's money laundering regulations that mean companies have to have all sorts of checks in place. So your bank has to make sure you're not laundering money. They can't just say, oh, well, that's the government's job, that's not our job. That's kind of what those big banks did when they were getting told that they were, allowing money to flow through their tills from drug lords, etc., in Mexico. And they were told, no, that's wrong. The rules say you have to police this. So all they're doing is applying something that already exists in law and putting it in the technology sector. Whether or not it will work, actually, I think there's a whole thing about the internet about how difficult it is to manage, and you could drive things into the dark web, and that's an even more difficult place to police. So
the companies will also say, won't they, well, we just cannot be on top of this much content that's being produced. Google will say, look at the hundreds of hours of YouTube that's uploaded every second. But you could just argue to that, well, don't allow people to allow hundreds of hours every second. Monitor it before it gets approved. I mean, what would be so terrible about that world?
Well, this is actually a path that I think would be quite a good way of the government going down, instead of their current way of let's restrict access to the internet and let's block it off and let's regulate it very strictly. I think it'd be better to help tech companies invest in something like AI, where they can develop computers that take this content down automatically. Because the stuff that is coming out that is extreme, it promotes violence, you've got to be relatively simple to identify with a well-crafted AI engine.
I think I've made pretty clear I'm for the idea of regulating some aspects of this. But if you drive it underground, and the underground part of the internet is famously difficult to police, monitor, regulate, even know where it is and everything else. So how do you prevent that? And what do you do if people do just take it off the mainstream internet?
Essentially, what this idea is, you're blocking it from one place and opening a door for it to be somewhere else. So then, if you blocked it from that place, say the dark web, which is accessed through special software packages, let's say if you block access to those software packages, they'll find somewhere else to do it.
But only if you're really seriously into it, surely. It's one thing, isn't it, to take the example of sexual abuse imagery. If you say we need to remove child sexual abuse imagery from online porn sites, then the argument that I just stumbled across it isn't there anymore. I was searching for young people, but I meant 18-year-olds, not 14-year-olds. If you have to go into the deep web and actively find it, it's quite clear what your intentions were. So it's still a good idea, isn't it, to take it off the open web? It removes that element of someone who's interested in 9/11 conspiracies, but isn't going to be the person that would necessarily be groomed to build a bomb.
But does it then make it harder for the authorities to track these people? Is there an argument there that actually if you're pushing it underground, it gets far harder to sort of, for the police and the security services to have a watch on these people?
I think the problem this would solve is radicalisation, or at least potentially would solve radicalisation. So that is the example of the disaffected youth who finds content that then turns them into something much more malevolent. If they can't find that easily, and they're not the person who started out looking for it by going into the dark web, you've solved that problem. Whether or not you've created another bigger problem elsewhere is a moot point.
And finally this week, Ashley, what have you divined from the last 7 days?
Well, this time it definitely was not the Sun what won it.
To many activists, tabloids and broadcasters like the BBC are the enemy. Last week, a video of a pro-Corbyn supporter burning copies of Britain's tabloids went viral. As one former editor of The Sun notes, the very idea of a newspaper seems antiquated to many young voters.
Generations now expect their information to be delivered instantaneously, and the idea of perhaps printing millions of print products and loading them onto a huge articulated lorry, taking them to all corners of the country, by which time they're 12 hours out of date, it is a massive challenge.
Dominic Myrne there, and before that the BBC's Amal Rajan, discussing the relevance of newspapers, specifically tabloids, after last week's election and its rather surprising result.
The reason I chose this week is the news that The Guardian is going tabloid, quote, which actually is to do with its format rather than its style, although some would argue the quality newspapers have traversed that way. The issue here is, I think, the finances of the press industry have changed the way it goes about its business, and actually it is no longer speaking to the country at large, and it certainly isn't apparently speaking to young people. And the question that raises, I suppose, is if the press is our fourth estate, and it is the watchdog, what does that mean for our democratic process?
And what does it mean for our democratic process?
There's still pluralism. Obviously, there's plenty of sites out there, and there's plenty of sites on the left and right that are springing up all over the place. It probably means our democracy is getting angrier, I suggest, because people are stuck in their social media bubbles. The newspapers are now chasing clicks online, and they're chasing a more promiscuous audience, so they're getting more and more entrenched in their positions, and they're making less and less money in any case. Readership of news overall is up, but actual people reading across different news sources and challenging their own assumptions is down. And I think that's why you're getting the level of vitriol in political debate you are. As for how we get out of that, I don't really have the answer to that.
I mean, there's also the question, isn't there, of whether the newspapers have managed to maintain the quality that they used to have 10 years ago when they had a more significant role. Anyway, I mean, Felicity, your job obviously is to read everything and then summarise it for your readers. Have you noticed a decline in quality of the printed press? I mean, there isn't the investment that there used to be. That's why The Guardian's going tabloid.
I don't think so necessarily. I mean, we're a very young publication, so we've only been going since 2015 anyway.
And your quality's only improved, of course.
Well, of course.
Yeah.
But I do think it's very interesting in the context of the election, when we were very cheered to see such a huge turnout among the young people voting. That was a really nice thing that we could put in our magazine and sort of say, look how many young people turned out. And I think that's partly because of social media and the political campaigns online, which were obviously incredibly powerful. I think they were done very cheaply on a very low budget, but obviously got to young voters very quickly. And I think that's great. However, I wonder whether a shift away, and I think that the tabloids, some of their campaigns against Corbyn were pretty disgusting, actually. So I think if there is a shift onto social media and that is inspiring a new generation of voters, that's a great thing. But I wouldn't necessarily say that the internet, again, is going to be the best place to make up your mind. You've got fake news, you've got echo chambers, and I think for our audience specifically, there are, just as many dangers online and on social media as there would be if you were to pick up a copy of The Sun or the Daily Mail and read whatever they had to say.
I think a lot of publications actually shot themselves in the foot when it came to the election, because I saw a lot of stuff that came up on my Twitter feed from tabloid papers that were basically saying, the young voters will ruin Britain. Make sure they stay at home. There was even I believe there was a Sun article that said it was like a 5-point plan of how to prevent your child from voting, or your young adult from voting. And I think that actually inspired a lot of younger people to kind of go, if that's the way you think, I'm going to go out and I'm going to vote in the opposite direction as to what you want me to.
Okay, so is it recoverable then? Because actually you've chosen this story as your story of the week, as a story that might have greater repercussions and significance than we realise. The tabloids didn't play the role they used to in the election result. The Guardian's going tabloid. So what? I mean, is this the pivot moment where from now on the press is not going to have the impact it used to?
I think we've already passed the point where the press has the impact it used to. I would argue that maybe the press hasn't had the impact it always thought it did anyway. Famously, The Sun, what won it? Actually, maybe The Sun was just following what it was seeing in the public mood. I guess the problem I have is that the public mood is harder and harder to discern. There's an awful lot of very challenging moral issues that are in the news on a weekly basis, and as we cover here. And there's never been more of a need for fact-checking, for honesty, for truth, for objectivity, and actually there's never been less of it in the media. My only hope is, to answer your question, that maybe people will begin to yearn for that again, and we'll come a bit full circle. But what will be left of the press industry by then, because they're in dire financial straits, is an open question.
And what is the role of the press as it's reflected in organisations like yours, which digest it and rebroadcast it? I mean, think about the paper reviews that take up the airtime on Sky News and the BBC. Should they start looking at Huffington Post and the Canary rather than looking at what's on the front page of the Mirror?
Well, there's a very good argument for it. I mean, certainly there's an argument that says that more young people were reading things like that, or certainly basing their news input from their Facebook feed. Facebook is already the biggest source of news, that is to say, the biggest point through which people access news in the world. So there's an argument that maybe we should be looking more at what's being shared there than just what's on a declining newspaper's front page.
But often what they are sharing there is stuff out of the Daily Mail, isn't it? And the BBC.
With some commentary, of course, and usually with, some kind of qualification. And that's kind of what we do. It's the idea is that we're trying to provide some analytical cut through on some of this stuff. I guess the reason we stick with the press is because they are, to a degree, subject to peer review. They do have a degree of independent regulation these days. They are subject to a level of scrutiny maybe that the Canary isn't, because it's the nature of its audience. So, it's still relevant to talk about them, but the worry is if that's what we're relying on to provide this watchdog role, and actually young people in particular are disengaged from it, then who is providing that role? Is it the BBC? I mean, the BBC is accused of bias from all sides as well, which probably means it's doing something right, but who are we relying on now to provide that objective watchdog role?
Okay, final question. The Guardian's going tabloid. They're ditching the Berliner. If you were the editor of The Guardian, would you have made that decision, Cameron? They need to save money. Is that the right decision?
Of course. I think it's a brilliant idea. To save money, yes. Yeah, go tabloid.
Felicity?
Yes.
Yes,
Innovation.
you would have. Yeah. Ashley?
Never would have gone Berliner in the first place. Why set up an independent press that costs £80 million for a size no other newspaper is using, so you can't get other business from elsewhere?
Because it looks really cool. That's why. Am I the only person who thinks this? I think it's a mistake. It's the only thing that makes them stick. It's the Toblerone of newspapers, isn't it? It makes them stick out.
It is, and they also make £38 million of losses according to their latest accounts, and apparently it's going to go out of business in the next sort of 2 to 10 years, depending on what its reserves are, if it doesn't do something drastic. So it looks cool, but it might be looking cool in posterity rather than...
Well, the question is when they shut down the presses altogether, of course, and just go digital, but maybe let's discuss that in a future week. That is it for this edition of The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to Ashley Wassall, Cameron Tait, and making a very promising debut, I thought, Felicity Capon. Thank you. For more from The Week, why not visit theweek.co.uk. Download our free iPhone app, The Weekday, or you can get the magazine direct to your door. Just head to theweek.co.uk/subscribe. You can find this podcast absolutely everywhere that does podcasts. We are promiscuous when it comes to our podcast feeds. Just ask your voice-activated service of choice. for The Week Unwrapped. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.